Okay, well, my clock shows 2:05, so I want to say thank you to all of you who have joined us, and we want to provide for you in about a half hour's time, maybe 35 minutes time, what we know and what we're working on in terms of online communities. And so on the screen you can see the questions that from the abstract that also kind of guided the preparation of this presentation. The first one in particular, how do we create an online classroom that is conducive to the development of mutual support, encouragement, and even friendship among adult learners. So I'm Bob Cotter from the Center for Teaching and Learning, working with Dr. Stella Marie from the BA program. And what we want to talk about today is online communities and even deeper than that, the relationships among students, between students, that those online communities depend upon to be successful. We are exploring this ourselves. We're going to talk a lot about what Stella's doing in her class, but we see this more as a beginning of a conversation, hopefully a conversation that will be institution-wide, and in fact will be led, and something that will keep going on. I've been here just a short time at Union, but I've had the chance to see the degree to which people emphasize online communities in their classes. And so we hope that this information we provide today is a step toward that. The other a couple of tent poles for this presentation. One is the part that Stella's exploring in particular is the ideas of relationship and relationship building, relational depth that come from psychology. To what degree can those be applied successfully to the online learning environment? Education in general, but particularly online learning. The second tent pole is this idea of communities of inquiry, which is a big topic in higher education right now and provides, we think, an interesting umbrella term for this relational component that we want to speak to today. A couple housekeeping items. You'll see a chat feature on your screen. We will save time at the end for questions, so as the questions occur to you, please put those into the chat. We have developed these slides for later reading. We're going to create a repository of not just the slides, but some ancillary materials. And so these slides are wordy. We're not going to read them to you. We're going to skip across them to highlight the big ideas. So when you see the first couple of slides, don't panic. And the other part is we're on GoToMeeting. Should we have some kind of communication issues, we might take our webcams out of play just to increase the bandwidth. So if we disappear, that's why. Okay, with that, let me get started. So if we were in the same room, I would be irritating you with an icebreaker exercise right now. But in lieu of that, this is somewhat presumptuous, but let me put out some things in front of us so we have some common nodes of reference. First is adult learning. These are things most of you, all of you know, I'm sure, Malcolm Knowles and his concept of andragogy, and we wanted to explain that that is a key part. We're building on somewhat on that framework, and especially in terms of the way he describes the need and the importance of adults leveraging their real-life experience toward their current learning experience. So how do you play off of what people know and use that as a base to create rich exchanges online, and not just conversationally, but also in terms of understanding and perhaps creating new knowledge. You also see on this slide an excerpt from an article, Engaging Adult Learners, and the first 2 points are the ones that really play toward what we're talking about today, which is create a safe, welcoming learning environment and a culture of empathy, respect, approachability, and authenticity. So that'll give you a little bit of a sense of what we're borrowing from Malcolm. The other focal point to provide us for our conversation is called the cycle of experiential learning. We find that this really resonates and actually adds a nice platform for the way that a lot of institutions that we've looked at for best practice describe their group sessions. They structure them in a very similar workflow in terms of experience to reflection to learning from experience, conceptualization, and then to experimentation or acting it out. So let's let that serve as our adult learning pillar, but I wanted to bring Knowles and Kolb in front of us both just to refresh what all of us know about those two. The second irritating icebreaker, have we been in the same place, would be to talk about the characteristics of a successful online community. So on the left side of the ledger, you'll see characteristics, aspects that speak to the delivery, design, execution of a class, course design, faculty role, students familiar with their personal roles in an online environment, communication, absence of technology issues. On the right side of the ledger, you'll see the more affective components of online community, healthy emotional climate, empathy and acceptance, authentic connection and engagement, treating individuals with dignity, trusting non-judgmental environment. So setting the stage for a rich exchange between students, not just socially, but importantly, yes, socially, but more than that, for their academic endeavors. And this side of the ledger then leads us naturally into what Stella is going to present about her course and her research. I'm going to switch the presenter role to her once I find you.
Does this help?
Which button now?
Okay. I think we're all right now.
Okay.
Sorry about that, folks. So, so I thought I would just share a bit about how I draw from my own discipline in psychology to understand the online environment. And here I find that the intersubjective field is quite a helpful concept in my teaching practice. And this point of view emphasizes how individual subjective positions of people in interaction create an interpersonal field, which influences, all of the participants. I think a parallel in education might be found in Paulo Freire's criticism of what he describes as the banking model of education, which I think we're all familiar with. And in this model, the teacher is in the position of depositing information or content into the minds of students, and he really replaces this with a bidirectional field of dialogue that redefines the relationship. So here I just have a brief quote from Freire. Through dialogue, the teacher of the students and the students of the teacher cease to exist, and a new term emerges. Teacher-student with student-teachers. The teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in dialogue with the students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach. And so they become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow. So I'm trying to get that to stop flashing. So I think that this perspective really involves a decentering of the teacher, who becomes more of a facilitator and a participant in the practice of dialogue rather than, a depositor of information or content. And if we think about the online classroom as an intersubjective field, we need to ask what are the qualities of the field in any particular class, and what qualities serve to deepen the learning. So in my own case, I have to say that I became interested in this partly because I found online teaching less satisfying when I started around 10 years ago. I came from a low residency program in which really deep and rich relationships between students were sort of built into the structure of it, and I could see how adult students in that sort of social, emotional context really grew intellectually and also personally. And it was interesting to me that I didn't feel that so much in the online environment, and that was especially interesting because some of the same students were in my face-to-face courses and my online courses. So I wondered about what creates relational depth in a face-to-face option that seemed, a little missing in the online environment. And I turned again to my own discipline. I think Bob, you might have the controls
Stella,
now.
we were having trouble seeing your screen, so it's back to me, and I can kick slides forward for you.
Great, yeah. So the next slide will just show the relational depth piece.
Okay.
Okay. In the field of psychology, there's a lot of research on this. I'll focus just on one small element that was contributed through Mears and Cooper. And you can see that the definition of relational depth from their research really focuses heavily on these qualities that Bob mentioned earlier: empathy, acceptance, kind of transparency. Relational depth in their research is defined very much in three domains: self, other, and then something that they call atmosphere or climate, and which I think relates to that intersubjective dimension. And so the characteristics that lead to relational depth from their qualitative research was empathy, warmth, a courteousness, creating a non-judgmental and a welcoming environment. So obviously, this is coming from psychology and education. There is an evaluative element, and that could be an interesting point of discussion for later. But I think that these facets of relating may be conveyed intuitively and even non-verbally in a face-to-face setting, and they may need special attention in a highly text-based environment. Part of learning how to enjoy online teaching was really about learning how to project myself as a social and relational being into the online environment, and how to use that to establish conditions of relational depth in the relationships that emerged with my students and between my students, most importantly. This projection of the social emotional self in the online field is known in that line of research as social presence, and I think Bob will talk a little bit more about how that is conceptualized in the communities of inquiry.
Okay, so let me lay a little bit more groundwork here with this idea of communities of inquiry I mentioned in the beginning. You see the text on your screen. The idea of that, and the reason that it was, we came to this kind of naturally, as opposed to retrofitting what we were doing to it, in the sense that it seems to be a great construct for the kind of interaction that Stella's talking about. And the other thing, as I mentioned before, it's a hot topic in higher ed. It's somewhat viral, so it's very easy to see a lot of people who are experimenting and exploring this idea. The concept is that it takes it a step above, social interaction, the social media familiarity that most people have, and put that in a relationship context into a better place in terms of academic exchange. As the text says, to construct personal meaning and confer mutual understanding. There's three components of it in most descriptions of it, as you see in the bullets here or in the graphic on the screen, starting from the bottom. Cognitive presence. The second is teaching presence. Very interesting, but both of them, our focus, though, is on social presence, the ability of participants to identify with the community, communicate purposefully in a trusting environment, and develop interpersonal relationships by way of projecting their individual personalities. And doing that without the normal information and nonverbal and other information we get when we're in a physical space sharing that with people. So it's really trying to take that idea of authentic, trusting relationships to the online environment. So that social presence piece is the part that we'll focus on going forward here in the presentation. And to help us with that, Stella found this great article called "The Ties That Bind" by Benjamin Kirwald, and it speaks a lot about. He's someone who started back in the. You probably heard this term, computer-mediated communication, where a lot of the emphasis was on the technology and the interrelationships that were somewhat bounded by and orchestrated by the technology. He's taking it up to a higher level with an assumption that for the most part people have much better and much more familiar communication mechanisms technologically, and so that there can be now a new emphasis on the social presence piece. So that's part of it. The other part is, as I mentioned before, he's exploring how we can create those authentic relationships, emotional, psychological, in an online environment without the helping tools that we have and that we're used to in a face-to-face environment. So social presence is the piece that we're going to pursue as we go forward here. Also from Kurwald's article is the idea of social relational mechanisms. And so what he did in his article is outline some of the attributes or characteristics that should be part of these online communities so that they have the right climate for the type of rich exchange that Stella's talking about. So just to go through those briefly, is commonality, that shared experience idea, that kind of thing. I think we've all had this in groups. Group dynamics exercises or any kind of professional development that involves bonding, where at the end of it you're going, how will we live without each other, and we'll have to get together all the time, and unfortunately that fades. But it's that idea that this shared experience has created a bond that might persist, and certainly that's the idea in the classroom. So commonality, safety. The ability to feel comfortable saying anything, exploring things outside of your comfort zone as a student, so as to expand your understanding and your knowledge. The trust component, same thing, creating that safe environment for experimentation. Respect, rapport, and interdependence. The idea that we're not individuals throwing our pieces of the assignment toward one another to achieve the objective or the homework assignment, but actually take that to a higher level where it's a true conversation, true good work is done, and there's evidence for it, but also there's a real internalizing of the material, so it persists with the student going forward. And now, Stella, I'm going to throw it back to you with this next slide.
Okay, so Kurwald proposed a developmental progression of dimensions of social presence that lead to this establishment of a dynamic, productive online learning community. And he suggests that really, as you can see in the chart, that the experiences of mutuality, safety, and trust are forerunners of that a productive capacity of the community. And suggests that instructors should be alert to these developmental signs and try to include them in their course design. So on the next slide, I would like to just sort of, by way of illustration, give you a few examples of this developmental progression in a class that we developed for the psychology major this past fall. I think that you're all going to recognize this progression occurring in your own classes all the time. I just found it was helpful to have a framework for understanding it. And so this is the Helping Relationships course, which offers the psychology students sort of an introduction to foundational attitudes and skills for the helping profession. And Bob and I worked closely in the development of this course. The template for it came from CTL, which I'd like to show you, but I can't. So I think I'll just try to explain, describe a few things that happened over the course of the 8 weeks. In the first week, I tried to establish the groundwork for this, these first stages of mutuality, empathy, and like-mindedness. And to do this, I borrowed directly from Rick Reed and Rick Chaffee's excellent presentation last time on adult learning and appreciative inquiry. So I used a discussion prompt that asked the students to describe a helping relationship in their own lives. This was their very first discussion. And this really was drawing on their lived experience of a topic. So I think you can see from the highlighted, I won't read the slide, but these are just examples, a small snippet from a very large discussion that that shows some expressions, beginning expressions of connection and mutuality in the discussion. You can sort of see the ideas. I know the feeling. You're so right. Those kinds of expressions. And the conversation. So this particular student, by highlighting or reaffirming how much she already knows about this topic. So that was our very first discussion. In the next unit, which I think is the next slide, we started to cover the topic of ethics. And here I wanted the students to really grapple with the experience of an ethical dilemma, so to give them a realistic sense of what it's like to be in that role, rather than to just have the right answer or produce a correct response. So this was a dilemma in which a counseling intern seeks. The question is whether or not the counseling intern should seek consultation regarding a client's disclosure of a possible crime. And I don't think you could probably see it from the slide, but there's a point of disagreement among the students, and they handle it actually very respectfully. But I choose to hang back in this discussion so that they can try to work it out between themselves. The student whose perspective is challenged in this little segment winds up really not feeling put down at all. So if you notice in the way that the students talk to each other, they're really quoting each other, which is a sign that I look for to indicate that the students are really listening to each other. They're actually using each other as sources of information and not only looking at the instructor. I feel that this represents Kurwald's dimension of feelings of safety and trust, because unless ideas can be challenged safely, there really isn't trust in the dialogue. And then my contribution really to the discussion was to summarize and synthesize the conclusions that the group reaches, hopefully demonstrating that they have produced some collective wisdom. I kind of collate excerpts from their various contributions, and I respond to them very sort of personally, saying that I was moved and impressed by what they came up with, and I send them an article in which a group of psychologists actually discuss this particular case, and I show them that in a sense they came up with the same conclusions that the professionals did. This is moving toward Kurwald's ideas of interdependence, group cohesion, and rapport, which is the next phase. So in the next slide for this course, we're in the stage of production. This is a skills-based course, and I wanted the students to have an opportunity to practice. But that was challenging in an online environment. I really didn't want them practicing on their family and friends for good reason. So I went to Bob and I asked him, gee, is there some way that we can get students to work together, and with audio and with video? We would need this to be recorded so that they could analyze it later. It would need to be easy to use. It would need to be free. And lo and behold, he came up with this conferencing tool, this video conferencing tool that the students were able to use, and it really enabled them to enact this practice piece of the course, which was so vital. I sort of thought that they might complain a little bit, something extra, difficult, new technology, but instead they really loved it. And you can sort of see some of the comments from this. The conferencing tool is called Zoom, and the students talked about how they made friends, how they learned so much more, how they had wished that we had done this right from the beginning of the class. It was kind of like the end of the class that we actually did this. So I'm just, again, sharing these illustrations as a way of highlighting that developmental progression. And I think this happens quite regularly in all of our courses. You might not be aware of it. So to bring more intentionality to this sort of process, we're going to focus now a little bit on some of the teaching practices that support this idea of social presence. I'll turn it back over to Bob.
Thanks, Stella. So a couple things and this is kind of leading us toward where we're going to continue to work on this and put information. We will add ancillary materials and the things that we come up with as we pursue this on the Wink site, the Wink group on Campus Web. This is a couple things. One is the negative. What are the things that get in the way of adult students interrelating? What are the fears and anxieties that they bring into the environment that cause dissonance and inhibit that ability to merge as a group? And as this is a distillation of a couple different research projects, but certainly the idea of technology, that idea of social isolation. How do you pull people who maybe prefer to stay autonomous? I'm kind of one of those people. How do you bring them into the mix, bring them into the light? People's self-perception, or if not real, that they lack self-directed learning skills. And that goes back to that student responsibility in an online class component where, students actually have a role to play in an online class. And once that's demonstrated to students, sometimes they balk a bit, not thinking they have the competencies. So how do we overcome that? Time management skills, same problem. And I know that's a frequent problem that you all face in your classes. This one was interesting. They're challenged by the idea that their voice is equal to the instructor's voice. They're so used to an environment of passive reception that they have a little difficulty getting up to the higher ground of actually being on equal footing with the faculty member in terms of sharing information. It's really within the learning communities. And the other is that challenge of the fear of being an active participant instead of a more passive role. Again, something I unfortunately can relate to personally. On the positive side, there is an opportunity in these online communities to leverage the familiarity that people have with networks and online networks, and beyond just social media. So a few I've noted here on the slide. Social communication and knowledge networks. Those are social environments, but they're also for informational exchange and idea generation. Communities of practice are maybe a more formalized version of that. That has to do with profession or discipline. And the third are professional networks, and LinkedIn is the one where most people are familiar with. The idea that you not only do you post yourself on an easy-to-design web page, but also you have the opportunity to connect to people and connect to people who are connected to other people. And so there is that, for the most part, in most learners, and there's ways to ascertain the incoming competencies of your students, but there is a way to leverage that. And it's an opportunity to take competencies and to play them toward the objectives of the course. Another piece that, and this certainly ties in with what Stella's talking about, but just to get in play that idea of emotional intelligence, and this is more intriguing than it is something that at least I know a lot about, but the idea of how do you take that emphasis on emotional intelligence, qualities of which are mindfulness and discernment, that idea that your antenna is always on and you're always monitoring both internally your own emotion and psychological state, but also externally, trying to pick up clues whether someone's in the right mood or the right place for this conversation. What are things that are challenging people? It's not easy to do, but it's easier to do in a face-to-face environment. So how do we take that into the online environment? How can we bring mindfulness in? How can we bring discernment, that idea to clearly see what's going on and have a real grasp of what's happening inside you and outside of you? I Jesuit trained to some degree, so that's why the Jesuit quote's there. But they have this interesting concept, this archetype, contemplatives in action, where people who are internally aware and cognitively working it, but also are very in-depth, in touch and in sync with what's going on around them, in particular in terms of interpersonal activity with other people. And another idea that's intriguing, more than that we can actually prove its relevance, but it's a really interesting idea, is this, well, a couple things. First, that idea that work life, social life, educational life are not distinct categories, but all blend. There's a natural and a positive blurring between those that presents a lot of opportunities in an online class. And the second is, some of you are probably familiar with that idea of the third place. Ray Oldenburg, in his book, The Great Good Place, he's talking about physical places, those places that are not work and not family, not home, but a third place that it's kind of an anchor in his mind for civic interaction and exchange. But he considers it an anchor, specifically, I mean, in particular, and he's talking about urban areas, but also how do you make sure that people mix in their busy lives that we have in a physical space? Can we take that to an online place? Can that third place be the online classroom or the online community? And could that serve as an anchor to base academic success on? So, intriguing and to be continued. Here we have, how are we doing on time, Stella?
We're at 32 minutes.
Okay. I don't see any questions yet, so this is your opportunity to stop us. But let me keep going with some examples that we found as we began some research on best practices, and this is just in its infancy. This is something from Bank Street College in New York, which I didn't know anything about. Last week there was what used to be the Sloan C is now the Online Learning Consortium, and a number of us participated in that virtually, or at least watched presentations, and there are a lot of them, and a lot of them had to do with online engagement and community building. Bank Street had identified these roles that they saw in students who were together for a period of time. And the idea behind this is that you start delegating authority to students who match these particular roles. And you can see them on the screen, validating learner, resourceful learner, etc. Need to find out more about that, in particular the time frames in which their courses and terms run. But it's an intriguing idea. The quote is interesting. These roles continue to deepen our understanding of how to nurture and support generative discourse and engagement in online communities. Research offers us an opportunity to see beyond traditional online discussion. So they're looking for building upon what they see already as a successful methodology, which is online discussion. And the idea of generative discourse, I think, means moving from more conversation-based activities to true intercommunication that facilitates understanding and perhaps builds new knowledge, at least within the context of the group. Another example is, let me change the screen, is something that Sacred Heart University presented. And now they're dealing with the cognitive presence here, one of those three legs of the community of inquiry. But they had a real nice information and really neat graphics on how they see groups on the left being inspired by outside influences, and then how they can associate attributes that each student should demonstrate in the course of those group processes. And the nice part about that was just that codification of those attributes, contribution, collaboration, etc. But even better was the fact that they had a rubric with which the instructor, Antoinette, could measure individual contributions to the group effort based on this rubric. And so that was a very interesting idea and something that we do want to pursue going forward. Do we have any questions, Stella?
Yes, we have a question. Have you experienced situations when students are not supportive and collaborative, but rather even dismissive of others' viewpoints and or disrespectful? So how have you handled that situation?
Well, I'm going to throw this over to you after I make this confession. Stella had sent me the text that she gives her students. I'll let her explain it. Basically, how she sets tone and tolerance parameters for her class. I neglected to throw it into a slide, but Stella, if you don't mind doing it verbally.
Okay, so basically, in my syllabus, I offer fairly, particularly for this course, very detailed guidelines about expectations around communication. And in one of them, I also indicate that, if a student finds that the tenor of a conversation, they have concerns about it, or if they find a remark offensive, that they should be contacting me immediately rather than responding to an inflammatory remark. I set the tone pretty quickly and early that I want engaged dialogue, that may be vigorous, may have strong views, but that's within the context of courteous speech. So part of it is really monitoring the conversation very carefully, and if I see something that looks difficult, I will also use the private remarks in Campus Web to rein in a student or to say something that I don't want to say to the whole group. That's one technique that I've used. But yes, it does happen. It certainly happens. It's a good question.
We do have a question about our materials, and we're happy to share. Is that right, Stella?
Yes.
Okay, and so what we'll want to do, me in particular, I want to make sure that I have all the attributions accurately noted on the materials, but certainly, and we'll certainly put them in the in Campus Web on the Wing site. But anybody who wants access maybe quicker than we get that together, feel free to email us.
Are folks able to use their mics? There was a question earlier. I think not. Okay, I'm wondering whether a pedagogical emphasis on social presence might prevent students from engaging in quiet study, contemplation, and introspection. That's an excellent question.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't really have anything to add. Let me think of something good while you go.
My own sense of it is that really, insofar as the online environment, this is from Karsten. Thank you, Karsten. Yeah, insofar as there's an expectation for for participation in the study discussion thread, an emphasis on social presence, I think, is helpful. But it doesn't mean that within the context of the term there aren't many opportunities or many parts of the course that would not include quiet study, personal reflection, not being constantly online, I think is what you're alluding to there. And yes, I think that's a very important part. Personal reflection is a very important part of what we're doing. So it's kind of a balance, is how I would respond to that.
Sorry, I think in a more mechanical sense, the part of what in the CTL we're trying to do is to encourage people to set the tone as far as expectations of what students should be prepared to do online, and so that they can kind of quantify the degree to which they're expected to interact, and so that that should help them then quantify the amount of time they have for perhaps a preferred style of study, which is the quiet, reflective time. So we're trying to get the word out that just setting that kind of in the here's the welcome to the class. Here's how we're going to get started. That's a good piece of information I think that students can use, especially in some of these classes that are fast-paced in the 8-week terms.
Okay, Bill Lips has asked, have you noticed any gender differences related in differences in the level of collaboration? I think that's a great question for the group. I personally have not noticed a difference. Proportionally in the BA program, there are more female students than male students, but for example, in the Healthy Relationships course, we had many very strong male students who participated a lot. They did a great job. So curious to know what other people's experiences on that.
Any other questions out there?
Oh, this is a great question. Who asked this? Lewis. Okay, so the question is, to follow up on your response to the earlier question, by responding offline to a student who has been offensive, do you leave the impression with the group that the offense has not been dealt with, which can impact the important feeling of safety? I think that if it's only dealt with privately, I think it really depends on the circumstances and the context of the question. If it's only dealt with privately, then there is that risk. I agree. You know, for myself, I think the first thing is to try to understand where a student who may have made an offensive remark is sort of coming from. Sometimes there's a lack of awareness of how a message has been conveyed and how it's been received. So I'm trying to look at both sides and create a sense of inclusion. But if it's necessary and it seems appropriate, then it may become a conversation in the group. What happened there, and how do we get past it? So I think it's a great question. I think it's very sort of context dependent. And I'm curious to know how other people handle that. And I think specific situations sort of enlighten us about how, in a particular instance, an instructor might handle a difficult interaction. Okay. So another question is, some students who take online courses resent being asked to participate in a group. This is coming from Linda. Hi, Linda. This divides more by personality than gender or race in my experience. To get over this hurdle, I try to make the first few discussion threads lighter, similar to icebreakers. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, and I mean it goes to what we were talking about in the first session of that Helping Relationships course. Thank you, Linda.
Okay, Stella, I think we've hit our time point.
Yep.
So first, thanks to you and everybody who participated and went through this with us. Thank you very much. To be continued.
Be continued, yeah. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everyone.